Welcome back, Year 10. Here comes part 2 of your lesson on Cory in the Winter. So, looking at the second half of the poem, then we move on to stanza 3, and it's actually the second line of that stanza which was the source of the most questions I think that people asked and comments as well. So, if you remember from the first half of the poem, the speaker has written out the words of this poem on the top of 4 cars outside the house of the addressee. So a couple of people were saying, well, what happens in this line? The woman next door drove off with stanza 2. Well, what part of this poem that's ready for the person to open the blind and read is written on this car, but she needs to go to work or whatever she's doing with her day. She drives off, and then that poem is then broken. So you're left with an incomplete or broken sonnet, which can be seen to symbolise this incomplete or broken relationship. So it's literally just that. One of the cars that this poem's written on is driving away. Of course, I think when it says she drove off with stanza 2, there's a possibility of slight confusion there, because we're reading a poem and we're thinking, has she driven off with a stanza of this poem? One person said, is the poet breaking the fourth wall there? And I thought that was interesting, because it just keys into that idea that nothing lasts. Even the poem that we're reading now, which if we're reading it in a book, is printed there in front of us, or there's a hint that it might disappear even while we're reading it. So you get that whole idea of transience that's in this poem, things not lasting. It does it in a very different way. I think it approaches that theme of transience or temporariness in a very different way from Ozymandias, but you got some of that same idea happening there. A couple of people talked about there's sort of being a sense of humour in this line. Partly that he's so carefully thought out this big romantic gesture, and then there's the humour of that being foiled by this woman just unwittingly driving off with part of his poem, and partly there's humour from the incongruity of the image. She drove off with stanza 2. How do you drive off with a stanza? You've got this sort of a poem and the car driving off. It's a kind of funny juxtaposition, and so that's another way in which that line works. So we're perhaps sympathetic to this speaker whose plan's going wrong here, but we're laughing at the same time about the comedy of the situation. Go back to the first line of the stanza. There was a nice point from one student was about of course it didn't work out like this. And she suggested that the use of course implies this person's done this before, or they've attempted something similar to this before, and might get us asking the question, well, why do they keep doing these things which isn't going to have an impact or which isn't going to work? And maybe that says something about love itself, that this maybe deep down they know that this is a futile gesture, or a gesture that's not going to be successful, but they can't help but do it. They're not totally in control perhaps of their own actions. As I watched by the hedge, so he's written his poem, and then he goes and sort of stands back and waits for the person to come out, and the snow starts again, the blizzard's coming down, so that's going to obscure what he's written. And even if that wasn't the case, out come the kids and they sort of sweep the last 2 lines of his poem off the roof of the car. They're going to make their snowman. So the poem continues to disappear through this stanza. And one student made the excellent point about the way that bits of his poem disappear bit by bit, suggest this idea of his hope disappearing bit by bit, this fading of the hope for this relationship. And he was so excited at the start of the poem about this gesture, which was going to show how much he loves this guy Cory. And then at the end of this stanza, it's all gone bit by bit. That poem's disappeared. And you've also got a couple of things about the idea that the weather's coming and spoiling his plans, and other people are coming and spoiling his plans. You got maybe this idea circumstances are against him. This love is something that it's not to be. He's done everything he can. He's written out his poem, and whether you take this as a story that really happened, or you maybe say, well, it's doubtful that he's written this poem on the top of 4 cars, but it's almost a metaphor for the fact he's done everything he can to make this work, or to persuade this person who he's in love with, but circumstances mean it's not going to happen. The car drives away, the children arrive and sweep up the snow, etc. And then the fact that he's not bargained for the idea that these other people, the woman going to work, the kids making their snowman, are going to spoil what's happened. Maybe that says something about his love. That it's almost like he's done all of this for Cory, and perhaps it should be obvious that some of these cars are going to drive away, or someone could move this snow. But because he's so focused on this love that he has, he's almost forgotten that anybody else in the world exists except for Cory. And so there's some pathos perhaps in that. We're laughing at the fact that this gesture sort of fails in these sort of slightly ridiculous circumstances, but at the same time it says something about the fact it didn't occur to him that would happen. There's almost this dramatic irony that we can look down and say, well, of course this wasn't going to work. And lastly on this stanza, as well as the fact that it's other people who come along and spoil his plan, it's also the weather. The blizzard summoned day, and just even the word choice there, summoned, suggests this idea of the weather being very much in control. And so you've got more snow coming and obscuring what he's written, and then in the last stanza we're going to have the snow melting, and it's this idea of I guess it's almost like nature's against him. And as well as keying into that idea that just it's like the fates are not on his side, this relationship isn't meant to be, there's also this idea of maybe powerlessness. If we key this into art, we've looked at poems this year through the prism of power and conflict. So if we're thinking about power here, he's powerless in this situation. The weather's going to come and spoil his plans, which is obviously is an image that we've seen before. I think as well it's quite interesting that he watches by the hedge as the blizzard comes along, and then as the school kids come along, he doesn't try and save this sonnet that he's created. Whether that's a shyness or a nervousness, or maybe by this point the car's driven off, so he's accepted the futility of the gesture. But either way, there's a sort of, he might be doing some big performance of a way of saying he's in love with this person, but there's another side of the character that we see here that at the same time is quite shy. He's hiding by the hedge and letting it all fall apart. Okay, so that brings us to the last couplet of the poem. So we said before that the rest of the poem doesn't rhyme, but we do end with a rhyming couplet, which is traditional for sonnets, and often that's emphasising the love between two people. And it's also often seen as emphasising the permanent nature of that love, which is not something that happens here, because we do get the couplet, but the whole idea here is that there's a lack of permanence in the relationship and in the symbol of that relationship and the shape of the sonnet. It had melted by noon, that sense of loss. And Lotzi talks about the idea that this ending to the poem shows us love is temporary, certainly in this case. Your sonnet in the snow glowed pale below the moon. So that's sort of really quite romantic. You've got this idea of something glowing, you've got snow, you've got a love poem, you've got this romantic image of the moon in the sky. But then the last line, rather than building on that, undercuts it. The curtains never opened. It had melted by noon. So you get that contrast, even while we've got a couplet, the two lines are joined together by the rhyme. They actually contrast with each other. He's throwing up quite a poetic line in line 13, but line 14, quite matter of fact. The curtains never opened, and then that short sentence, it had melted by noon. Okay, so hopefully that sort of covers a lot of the points that you made and answers the questions that people had. Here's some of people's favourite lines that you can have a look through. Some of those we've mentioned them as we've been discussing the poem over the last sort of 20 minutes or so. Yeah, here's some more sort of favourite bits that I've sort of copied and pasted that people picked out. And if we're then thinking about the two poems together, there's a series of connections that we might make. And again, these are taken from people's messages. So they've both got a lover addressing in the first person and the second person, using that second person you, a romantic partner or a potential partner. But then there are differences in terms of we don't get that repetition of Paris here. Maybe we get semantic field. One person picked up on the semantic field of poetry, like stanza and couplet and sonnet, which, like Paris, could be seen as kind of a fabricated version of love and artifice rather than the real thing. Or maybe rather than repetition here, we've got the structure by the fact that we've got a sonnet and we've got that rhyme at the end. You can see someone saying that it's sadder than in Paris with you. In Paris, we maybe start with sadness, but we come to some sort of hope or enthusiasm by the end. Whereas here, we start with enthusiasm and we end in sort of sadness or loss. So, yeah, quite a few connections you can make, even though the poems are in some ways different from one another in terms of their style and in terms of their overall effect. Okay, so I said before, hopefully I've answered sort of people's questions. There's a few here though that I just want to sort of touch back on before we finish the video and wish you a happy weekend. We've talked about the fact that we almost deliberately we've got a sonnet but not sonnet. We've talked maybe a little less about this idea of nature and humanity side by side, so maybe we'll sort of touch on that a little bit more. And that might be seen as one of the answers to the question here, which is obviously a big one. What are the actual themes in the poem? Well, I think certainly we've got this theme of love, and within that theme of love, maybe one of the questions to ask yourself in terms of deciding what you think about the poem is this just about one relationship, one story of one person's love, or has it got bigger things to say about love in general? If it does, then we might think about the idea of love as something that's transient, that doesn't last, that melts away like the snow. Or we might think about love as something that makes us do silly things or foolish things. The big gesture of writing a poem on cars in the snow is obviously a futile way to act. And even if that's an exaggerated version of real life, we don't know for sure that it's something that really happened rather than something that's invented. We still might say, well, the poem's telling us something about how love might cause you to act in a way that you know, if you thought about it more carefully, is foolish or is pointless or is a waste of time. And we've got the idea that's linked to that about powerlessness in love, and you're kind of helpless because you're at mercy not just of the other person who in this poem chooses not to open the curtains, but also those bigger forces of circumstance and fate and nature and so on. So in terms of that idea of man-made images and natural images, you've perhaps got the idea that lots of the natural images like the snow and the moon are linked to this romantic idea, but at the same time you've got some of these man-made things like the cars and the curtains which block that off. One student also suggested that by using both in the poem, the poet is trying to say something about the all-encompassing nature of the speaker's love. So I think that more or less covers things. Hopefully I've answered all the questions that people had, and this has been useful. In terms of task for Tuesday, it's on the screen now, ready for Tuesday's lesson, that is, and I'll stick it on Show My Homework as well. I wish you all a lovely weekend. I'll see you soon.